wait, remind me of which one when I want to go forward.
Yep, just that one. And
Okay.
this one's backwards.
Yep, okay.
All right, go ahead.
All
You got the
righty,
floor.
I think I'm just gonna put it closer.
Yep, as long as you can
And-
see yourself all right there.
Now, let me just back up for a
So I'm just
minute.
gonna pull this back just a tad
Why
there.
didn't it go back?
So I just gotta click the page. So I'm gonna minimize you
Okay.
and then,
One of those plastic cups, paper cups, fill it with that cheese.
Okay.
so I'm gonna mute everyone just so we can give MaryLu the floor here. Like I said, if you could just handle that as well, that would be great. Thank you, Carol. And I don't, where's
Now,
the-
can we put me back in the corner?
you are in the corner there. It just
I am in
doesn't
the
show it.
corner?
Yep.
I don't see it.
I just try to,
If I can't see it, I don't believe it.
okay.
It's okay.
Here you go. Oh, that's Carol.
No, that's Carol.
When you talk, your face will come up here.
Really?
Mhm.
You think so? I'm talking, I don't see it. Don't mind us, folks. We're just still playing around here, getting the magic box to work.
All right. Carol, please mute everyone. Let's just see if we can get this here.
Yep.
Now what?
I'm just waiting for everything to get set. Oh, okay, she's handling it. So let's see here, just make sure.
There we
You are
go.
sharing, so you
There
are
we
there.
go. Okay.
But I
So,
am gonna minimize it, so. I
yeah,
don't
because we
cover
don't
your screen.
really need those people to clutter up the view.
There we go. Go ahead.
All set?
Mhm.
Okay, I can't see myself.
It's all right.
Oh, well.
Just don't move from where you're at. There you go.
Okay. Well, greetings, everybody. I'm still, as you know, new at this sort of thing. I grow the plants, plan the garden, weed, hoe, et cetera, take beautiful pictures. But anything beyond that point, once again, I don't think Terry's listening, but Terry Haas, a fellow master gardener years ago, would always come to the rescue at this point and with her skills on the computer, convert what was on my camera to what you are now seeing. Welcome, everybody. After several inches of snow for 2 days, it seems like spring has come back. And once again, we can start thinking about what we're going to do in our gardens. I must admit, when I was thinking about this morning, foliage plants for the shade garden, Kermit came to mind. I'm sure you all remember Kermit when your kids or your grandkids were watching. What was it? Sesame Street? Always going around moaning how it was hard to be green. Well, I don't think Mother Nature agrees with Kermit because most of the natural world is green of one sort or another. And therefore, this particular program is going to focus on leaves and fronds, if it's a fern, and most of them are green. We have a beautiful PowerPoint from my own Woodland Garden, shade garden. But first, I need to do my opening presentation. And I'm sorry, you're just going to have to look at this Christmas fern for a while. And I'm assuming this, what I see is a green band across the Latin name, doesn't show on your screen. We have to thank Terry for the Latin. She's one of these rare souls that actually took Latin in high school. I never did, and I can't pronounce it, so I'm just going to stick with the common name. So while you kind of gaze at this gorgeous Christmas fern, I just wanted to present a little of the ideas that you need to know about 1, shade, and 2, light. Anybody that's ever had a shade garden or thought about shade in general realize there are quite a few kinds. We have the shade in the woodland garden, a deciduous garden in the springtime is very different when the sun is shining through the empty tree leaves, no leaves, in April and May, early May. Later on in the summer, depending on what kind of trees you have in the canopy, that's the big tall ones, it's probably a dapple shade. Then there's half-day shade, east side, west side of your house, or a fence or a hedge. And then On the north side of your house, it's shady most of the time. In high summer, June, July, there's at least a 3-foot band of shade to the north side of your house. Then we have the full dark shade you find under evergreen trees. We're not going to deal with that shade. That's difficult to grow things in, and I don't try. So we're not going to talk about that. What kind of conditions then? And this is mainly in the deciduous woods. Now you can duplicate those environments near your house on the north side, maybe the east side, or under a tree in the lawn, maybe, or in the shrub border around the edge of your lawn, maybe. So I'm going to talk briefly about what kind of conditions these plants grow in the different kinds of shade you will find. Obviously, a deciduous woods for hundreds or thousands even of years have dropped leaves and they decay over time. And so the soil in the deciduous woods tends to be very humusy, rich in decayed leaf matter. It's also humid in the woods. And that's, of course, if you think about it, the trees are absorbing the water. They go all the way up to the top and out to the leaves and they evaporate, transpire. And so, especially on a hot summer day, you walk into the woods and it's going to be a more humid feel to the air. It's also going to be 10 degrees cooler. And I'm thinking, as you all know, our summers are getting hotter and hotter. Who wants to be out in a sunny, hot garden during the day? And also the sun isn't as friendly as it used to be to our skin. So having a shade garden has more advantages, I think, these days. It'll be 10 degrees cooler in the woods. The trees also protect your plants from the wind. So what else? The pH in our woods here in Allegheny County tends to be in the low sixes, a slightly acidic floor soil in the woods. So the kinds of plants that grow there want to be more of a pH 6 type plant. So I think, let's see. Oh yeah, one last thing about the woods. It's cooler in the woods in the summer, but in the fall, anybody that has a vegetable garden, you know how come September, especially October, you listen to the weather report because those early frosts, if you can protect your plants, they can grow another 2, 3, 4 weeks even maybe. The woods, still with their leaf cover, is going to be warmer on frosty nights because the leaves, the canopy, act as a blanket and reflect back the heat that's radiating from the earth. So whereas in the summer it's cooler, in the fall it's warmer. Alrighty, end of soil conditions and types of shade that you're going to find in this talk. Now, the following, which is about light. Even though I was a chemist once upon a time and a science major, I never knew about this aspect of gardening until fairly recently. So I hope you get excited as I did about it, because you're going to learn something, I think, new. Y'all remember, when was it, 10th grade or something? Mr. Roy G. Biv? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. I was thinking about that this morning, and it was Newton, I believe. And the reason Newton was stuck at home on his estate rather than in one of the universities in England teaching was that they had a recurrence of the plague and the schools all shut down. Does this sound familiar? And they all had to go home. Of course, in those days, they didn't have our magic boxes to play with. So he went into his lab and he played with other stuff. And one of the things he did, of course, was that beam of light in the dark room through the glass prism, and voila, on the far wall, the rainbow, the spectrum, Roy G. Biv, the various wavelengths of light, which when all mixed together, unseparated, makes daylight, sunlight, white light. Now, in much more, that was way back in the 1600s sometimes. In recent times, scientists have discovered the following. It's the red end of the spectrum that encourages flowering. Do you ever wonder why some of the mulches The plastic mulches that you lay down are red, and those water towers around your tomatoes are red. They are to encourage the plants to flower. And if you have no flowers on a tomato plant, you're going to have no tomatoes. The middle of the spectrum, green, the plant does not absorb. It does not utilize the energy from the green light waves. It reflects, bounces it all back, which is why we see it as green. On the far end, the blue, indigo, violet, the blue end, that's what the plant uses for growing. So what happens with plants in the woods? The leaves, which are green up on the top between the plant and the sky, absorb the blue-green end of the spectrum. And therefore the plants that need that for growth are, comparatively speaking, smaller than they would be if they grew in full sunlight. The leaves, on the other hand, tend to be larger. That's because they are trying to absorb the dimmer, less light. Okay, now the last thing about light, four aspects of how it affects the plants. We already talked about color, the difference between the red and the blue end of the spectrum and how the plant uses it. The other 2 and 3 are combined, intensity and duration. Y'all know it's easier to get a sunburn being out for an hour in the sun in late June than in late March, because the sun higher in the sky is hotter and brighter, more intense. Duration is how long. So the rough formula is, if the plant gets 2 hours at noontime, that's equivalent to 6 hours early in the morning or late in the afternoon. And the fourth thing is direct light and reflected light. Now this particular Christmas fern that you see is planted on the north side of my house. I have a 2 foot wide, maybe 2.5 foot wide bed that runs 20 feet along the back side of one part of the house. And behind it, you see my simple, unpainted, unstained board and batten wood house. If I wanted to have more light on the north side of a fence or a building, you paint the building or the fence white, and that will bounce back more light reflected onto your plants. So they're getting more than just the ambient light on the north side of the house. Okay, I think I'm going to break up my talk. We're going to look at plants now, the fun part of the talk. And then in the last 10 minutes, we will spend talking about how do you, if you want to, prepare a bed for a shady garden, okay? So as I said, this is a Christmas fern, which does grow here and there, scattered, not a lot, in my woods. And something you have to keep in mind that, oh, what did they say about Rome? Rome was not built in a day, no. And if you want, especially ferns in your shade garden, most of them take quite a while to get big. This one I dug up as a baby, probably close to 30 years ago, let's say 25 years ago. And as you see, it's only what, maybe 2 feet in diameter now. It's a clump type fern, and it grows slowly. So of course I didn't fertilize it, besides mulching, but I tend to, in a wildflower garden, try to mimic Mother Nature. I don't add fertilizer. Sometimes I adjust the acidity with sulfur, but I let decomposing leaves and pine needles act as nutrients for these plants. So they probably would have grown faster if I'd added some chemical fertilizers. But it's a beautiful plant. It is evergreen, which is nice. I think there's different theories as to why we call it the Christmas fern. If you look at and once again, It's not a leaf, it's a frond. And forgive me, I forget, I'm not a fern expert, the little, whatever they're called on the frond. If you looked at each of those little ones, they're shaped like a Christmas stocking that you used to hang by your mantle. The deer, when we talk about how to do a garden, we'll talk about, do you have deer problems? Deer will munch on these, so they might need protection. Where's my arrow? Most of the plants you will see are indigenous to the Northeast woodlands. Not all, I'll mention. The deer fern actually, I think, comes from the West Coast. And in my garden, you see it's planted at the base of, I think, a red maple tree. It has not gotten very big over the years, maybe 6 inches tall. Out in San Diego in my daughter's garden, they grow to 2.5 feet tall. More sunshine, less root competition. And they also are evergreen all winter long. And once again, grow in a clump. If you're planting a garden, maybe we should make the distinction here. Mother Nature or whoever creates her own gardens, willy-nilly. And usually what grows depends on the soil type and the moisture and the sunlight. But to me, having a garden is not imitating nature. It's creating a pattern using plants of different shapes and colors to create what you think of is a beautiful arrangement. So where was I going with this? I don't remember. I got sidetracked and I forgot. I planned my gardens in the woods so that the plants that were adjacent to each other complemented each other in color or texture or form or time of bloom. Now this is a plant that does grow in the East, ebony spleenwort. However, I hemmed and hawed. I bought some of these ferns I got from either my woods or friends' woods. Some I bought through the special catalogs. This one came from a special catalog. You'll notice I've planted 2 of them. They're very tiny. They only grow about 6 to 8 inches tall. And they have a lovely black stem in the middle. Very delicate, very beautiful. But you see the 2 of them are growing out of a moss-covered old cinder block. As a matter of fact, they're probably not listening, but the Cornell boys, who aren't boys anymore, who owned this land originally with their dad, had built or were in the process of building a camp out cabin in what is now the woods behind my house. And so 35 years ago, when I first came here, I'd find these cinder blocks sitting around and they were all covered with moss. Now, the reason I did this was ebony spleenwort, unlike most of the ferns that grow here in a pH 6 acidity, need a more neutral soil, pH 7, or maybe even a little higher. Cinder blocks leach out chemicals that will create a more neutral soil. So to counteract the acidity of the natural soil in my garden, I thought, well, I'll plant them in this cinder block and maybe they will thrive. Well, of the 5 original ones, I think I still have 2 left, but they're not exactly thriving. So once again, it's probably easier to go with the flow. See what kind of soil you have, see what kind of shade you have, see what your pH is, see what your moisture conditions are, and then go with what will grow easily there. Otherwise, you make a lot of extra work for yourself and then heartache when all that extra work still doesn't make it grow, it dies. Now, this is part of that garden strip behind the house, and it's a lovely, beautiful Japanese painted fern. And I need to tell you a story about where this came from, because for me, plants in a sense are like people. They have a history, and knowing the history makes the plant more interesting. I don't know if any of you knew my Turkish roommate from college, Ingi. She now has, for many years, has lived in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown, I think it is, about 2 miles from the Capitol. And her house is only 14 feet wide, can you believe? And the garden behind her house is also 14 feet wide and 40 long, 20 for garden and 20 for slabs under an arbor where they parked the car. She hired a lady garden landscape designer to design for her 20 by 14 feet butterfly garden. And then that lady planned it and hired, I'm guessing, illegals who came in for the weekend, 5 of them, totally stripped what was there, put down 3 inches of whatever, and super planted. $7,000. Imagine that. Well, of course, the lady architect totally overplanted the garden. 4 times at least as many plants as would thrive there. Of course, she got paid by the plant. And she did not take into consideration the 2 huge shade trees on either side of this 14-foot strip in the neighbor's garden. For a butterfly garden, you really need sunshine. So the next year, Angie was giving away plants because she had too many. And fortunately, she gave me this beautiful Japanese painted fern. Now you can't see it. The house is behind it. The stone edging is in front of it. It's a raised bed about 4 inches high. The lawn comes towards you, but there's a narrow strip about 4 inches, 5 inches of sand, a band of sand to help keep the lawn out. Well, after 3 years, this particular fern said, I'm really happy here. I really like it here. And if you want to really get confused about sex in the plant world, try and figure out what ferns do in the dark of the night, because it's very confusing and I don't really understand it. All I know is that every year since then, 2, 3, 4, 5 little babies pop up in the sand edge. And I've given some of them away to you all. Some are transplanted into my woodland garden. So this is a very happy escape from DC fern that's now living in my backyard and in my woods. This is a ghost fern. Oh, by the way, take a look back up at the Latin. I can't pronounce it. The ATHY, etc. And the ghost fern, same family. So what happened was, and once again, I don't know exactly when, I'm going to guess 30 years ago. And I think it was in North Carolina, a lady who was into horticulture noticed that in her garden, she had some Japanese painted ferns and some and some lady ferns, which grow everywhere up and down the East Coast in the woods. And once again, in the middle of the night, Romeo and Juliet. And we wound up with a hybrid, which they named the ghost fern, which is a pale green, very beautiful. Once again, it grows in a clump, so it's fountain-like. It grows taller than the Japanese painted fern, and it's a beautiful fern. The thing with hybrids, it's like zebras and horses, they don't normally mate. So I don't believe this will spread by, somebody's online. Hi, who's that? So they would spread by extending their root system, growing the size of their crown, which after several years you could divide and make 2 plants out of the one. And this is just an overview of that back a 2-foot strip behind the house, because I wanted to point out the maidenhair fern there on the left. Beautiful, you can't see it, black shiny stems, very wiry, with these beautiful tiny fronds that kind of spread out like your hand, unlike most ferns that come from the center of the clump and flow outwards. The stems come up, but the ferns are shaped like the fingers on your hand. And they are quite a beautiful fern. I had to buy those. Didn't have any in my woods or any friends that had them. Now, a rock with moss on it and some false lily of the valley. I had to just mention, in the beginning, way back when, 4.5 billion years ago, as our planet formed, and at first was just a rock that was red hot. And eventually, after, I don't know, a billion years, we started to make an ocean. And then gradually we had land come above the ocean. And originally life was all in the sea, the algae, the plankton. But then some very hardy things called lichen and moss, and then the ferns started creeping out, covering the rocks, converting it to soil, and taking over the terrestrial planet with life, green life. I'm always amazed, especially if you get caught up in the nilly-willy of all the confusion of modern living. Look at a fern and say, you know what? That the parents way, way, way back are a good 300 million years old. Really, the ferns figured things out, how to create life that would last on and on and on. All righty, so now the moss, I have a whole talk on moss, but if you think it's hard to pronounce the Latin for plants, it's impossible for the moss, so I don't even try. I have 3 or 4 kinds of moss in the woods, but we'll leave that for another day. These tiny little leaves form a ground cover that's quite open, not dense. They start coming up in early May usually, and then later in May they have 6-inch tall stalks with fuzzy little white flowers on them. And they're called false lily of the valley because they sort of look like the leaves do lily of the valley. Now, finally, flowers. You see, we're not going to see many flowers this time, but these are Lenten roses and hellebores. About, I'm going to guess again, 30 years ago, the industry realized, we should start hybridizing these Lenten roses and push them on the market. And they did, and they've come up with some really incredibly beautiful Lenten rose flowers. The trouble with Lenten roses, most of them hang upside down. So unless you're a chipmunk running around on the ground and looking up, you really can't see the center. But we grow them because 1, they're a great plant to grow in the shade. 2, with global warming, sometimes they actually bloom in late February, if you can believe that, and definitely by the middle of March. They're out there blooming in the woods. So Lenten roses is something you might want to, if you are more into flowers than just green leaves, even though flowers, if it's a perennial, usually only last 2 to 4 weeks, and the rest of the year it's green anyway. And annuals, depending on whether you cut them back, pinch them back after they bloom, you can get annuals to bloom longer. But for most of the life of a plant above ground, it's green of one sort or another. So you might want to look into Lenten roses. Now, in a little bit, we're going to see the American wild ginger. This comes from Europe. And I like this one because it's dense. It covers the ground in a mat. It's shiny. And why do we like shiny? Why do we like diamonds more than rocks? I don't know. We just do. So it has shiny green leaves. Once again, if it's not too cold in the winter, or if it's covered with snow, they will stay evergreen all winter, but usually they look pretty raggedy come spring. And the deer, if they're hungry, will eat them. This is another West Coast visitor, which is pretty amazing. The flower is just a tiny little, 1/2 inch at the most, white flower, very early in the spring, hardly noticeable. You grow it for its leaves. And aren't they wonderful? Twin leaf. And depending on whether it's a wet year or a dry year, in a drought year or a dry year, the pair of leaves there only goes about 6 inches. But in a good year, it'll be more than 1 foot in diameter. It just keeps growing all summer long. So we don't really grow twin leaf for the flower, we grow it for the leaves. Okay, that's pretty bright. Okay. The British are known for their primroses. Think of cowslips, the yellow wild primrose of the hedges in England. Primroses are very complicated as far as there are many, many species, at least a dozen. And 2 or 3 are common in the trade, as they say. I tend to like the primroses that form clump. This one tends to run, which is nice. So if you guys come for my woods walk, you might get one to take home because I always have extras and they are beautiful. The leaves tend to be lobed, sort of roundish and scalloped and yellowy greeny in color. But then come May, they send up this, I don't know, 6-8 inch stalk of lavender pink flowers that lasts, what do they last? Maybe, depending on the weather, if it stays cool, they'll last a month. If you suddenly get one of these crazy 80-degree weeks in the middle of early spring, then they're gone, you know, in maybe a week. Back up to the heliobores, the Lenten roses, those flowers last 3 months. Pretty amazing. They start in the middle of March and to the end of May, they're still there. I don't know why that is, but they just hang in there. Okay, primroses. The other basic kind of primrose is the candelabra one, which is more of a clump growing. And then the stem is 1 foot to 18 inches tall, and you have the ball of flowers at the top. I have discovered in my woods, these run and increase. The Rex, who was a member of our group for many years, gave me some of his, some seeds from his. They're the candelabra type, and they've begun to self-sow in the ditch in the middle of my woodland garden where it's damp, wet, quite wet. Well, as a matter of fact, it's a stream for 4 to 6 weeks in the spring, but they grow. Now, this is so bright, it's going to be hard to see, but I can't see it, but I know it's there. Here, they can't see me point my finger to the screen, can they?
Not to the
Not to the screen, okay. To the upper right of the plant, there's a little blue cluster of flowers, and then there's some down at the bottom, but you can't see them, the color's off. This is Brunera, and the variety is Jack Frost. Once again, this is a plant that has been bred for the industry. And so now I have at least 3 Bruneras, all different varieties. And some have much more of a silver, pale, pale, pale green leaf. Some have much bigger leaves, but they all have these lovely, they almost look like forget-me-nots. The same blue flower cluster. Now, Jeremy, is there a reason why this is so washed out in color?
Yeah.
Well, guys, you're going to have to use your imagination. Y'all know what a bleeding heart looks like. I'm thinking I had 2 bleeding hearts for how many years? 30 years. And as you well know, for 3 springs in a row, for 2.5 solid years, we had so much rain that at least here on my hilltop, even in the lawn, all year long for 2.5 years, squish, squish, squish. In my woods, the depressions were vernal pools that lasted all year long. And my bleeding heart died off after all those wet years. And I'm thinking it just couldn't, even though it had a very rich humusy soil and it was built higher up than the surrounding ground, it just couldn't take the wet, wet, wet for so many months. But it's a wonderful shade plant. Whoops. Jeremy, when I click it, it's not going forward. What's happened? We're all on pause here, folks. I clicked
It's
it.
because I hit the page. There you
Oh,
go.
all right.
That works.
Now we're, okay. Well, this is a washed out, at least for me, it's washed out. Maybe it isn't on your screen. Who can't love a bleeding heart bush? I mean, any child of any age would be totally captivated by this plant. The other thing about this, when I first moved here, I had this plant on the east side of the house in the morning sunlight, afternoon shade. And in those days, it was the first week in May, usually, maybe the second week in May. It'd be warm enough to have the window open, the screen on, and I'd be doing something in the house and not hear. And the first year was like, what's that? And I looked, and there was the first hummingbird of the season gathering nectar from the bleeding hearts. So the bleeding heart and the hummingbird seemed to be in tune in those days. The bleeding heart bloomed, the hummingbird was back from the south. Now that's our bloodroot. Sorry guys, no pictures of the flowers this time around, just the wonderful leaves. Once again, very lobed, quite round. The interesting thing, if you've seen these early in the spring, this is later in the summer, they are not ephemeral. Those leaves will last all the way through summer. But in the early spring, the flower stalk comes up and the leaf is wrapped around it. So if it's a cold, gray, wet, snowy day, the leaf stays as a cloak wrapped around the flower, protecting it. And only opens up and allows the flower to open up when the sun comes out. Now this makes a great ground cover because the leaves are very dense. Once again, they're shiny. And a color I don't, as some of my friends know, I don't particularly like yellow in my garden, but it's a great woodland, shady kind of loving plant called a false strawberry. And it's not related to the strawberry botanically in any way. Look at the Latin name. But the leaves sure do look like strawberry leaves. So that's why it got its nickname. There's the wild ginger. Now this is something for some reason I just have not had good luck with. Twice my friend Wayne Wells over towards where? Cameron Mills has it growing underneath a tree in his yard. So it has, I'm guessing, shade from 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. And it's marvelous. It's a big circle around the tree trunk, thick, gorgeous. I bring home a clump and put it in my woodland garden, and it tends to disappear. Now I know slugs love to eat it, and maybe I get so busy with the vegetable garden and mowing the lawn that I kind of let the woodland garden go after the early spring days. Maybe the slugs come at night and just eat it up, or maybe the deer come and eat it up. I've tried twice, and I just don't seem to be able to get it to grow for me. Here is another plant that the industry took hold of 20, 30 years ago, the coral bells, Heucheras, and have gone crazy with the leaf color. For years, 10, 15, it was all the lavenders, the purples, the dark purple, the silvery purples, the amethyst. And in the last 5 or 6 years, they've gone to the orange and bronze and other weird colors. However, color is somewhat subjective. This one happens to be planted out in my patio rock garden, but I have coral bells growing in the shade. As a matter of fact, these are the plants that need dapple light or maybe morning sun because their color, excuse me, is best if they have at least 4 or 5 hours of sun. They will grow in the shade, but their color is best when they get a little bit more sun. And this, I think, let me see. Yes, this is going to be our last color point picture here. And this is another sad, it was a success for quite a few years, maybe 8. But once again, a year ago, died out. Bunchberry, a member of the dogwood family, only grows about 4 inches high. Has dogwood-like, well, those really aren't the flowers, which is true on the dogwood tree too. They're the sepals, and the flowers are tiny little yellowy ball-like clusters in the middle, which turn into scarlet red berries in late summer. This is a zone 2 plant, 50 below. And the literature said it may not continue to bloom and produce berries in warmer climates. Well, I planted it on the north side of the house, and it's an acid lover. You need a pH at least of 6, preferably I think 5.5. and it slowly spread. But then 2 years ago, it started to falter. And then last year it died. And I really don't know. I know the dogwoods are having a disease problem. Maybe it's that. You know what I just saw out my window? The first bumblebee of the year just went by.
I just saw that too.
You see that, Jeremy?
I just saw it hit this window too.
Yeah. They never sting, but the female, the queen bees hang around for a couple of weeks. Okay, so anyway, it's died off, and I don't know if it's that disease that begins with an A, or if it was just the wet, wet, wet 3 springs, or if it's just getting too warm for it. I don't know, but I'll miss it. It's a beautiful, beautiful plant. Okay, before I open it up for Jeremy, how much time have we got left?
You can finish up whatever you're doing.
Okay.
15, 20.
Okay, so I'll take about 5 to very quickly go through what I did in my woods. By the way, I have a wonderful woods, 10 acres, and it's never been cleared to farm. It's always been woods. They did log it 50 some years ago, selectively, but there were quite a few wildflowers already there. The shade was already there. Some trees were 100 years old, and some, when I first moved here, were a year old. And now with the deer, most of the new growth, especially for the maples, the oaks, and the cherries, they don't get a chance to grow because the deer chew them up and just keep them until they die in the second year. So that's become a problem. So I used that wonderful woods to create, starting about 15 years ago, I think, my shade garden, woodland garden in the woods. And what I did was in the fall, ahead of time, one of the wonderful things about shade gardening is you don't have any weeds. Because most of the weeds we think of in our garden are sun lovers. So anyway, I created in my mind on a map a certain number of beds. And once again, they're all more natural in shape, no squares, no rectangles, okay? And I cleared out any weeds, undergrowth that happened to be there, and then simply added 6 inches of topsoil, sand, peat moss, if you don't like peat moss, leaf mold, old manure, to a depth of 6 inches. And then because I happen to have 2 piles of stones in my woods from the days when they hayed the 10 acres in front of the woods, I lined the beds with those stones to give it some support so it didn't kind of like wash away from the 6-inch pile. And then I mulched it with 2 to 3 inches of mowed up leaves on top of the leaves that just fell naturally in October. So I did this in the fall. In the spring then, I transplanted either from my woods, friends' woods, or from the nurseries, the plants that I had decided I wanted to grow in the shade, in the woods. I mulched it once again with maybe another inch of mowed up leaves, pine needles mix. The first year, I watered it pretty well, just like you would any newly transplanted garden bed. One of the things you have to realize, the trees are the big guys on the block, and they suck up all the moisture. There's plenty of water in the ground from the winter, from the snow melt, from the spring rains. Usually you don't have trouble until maybe late June. That's why most of the spring ephemerals bloom those first 2 months. They can't compete with the big guys, so they go dormant by the end of May, usually. Go underground and say, goodbye, 10 months, I'm gonna hibernate, go dormant. But if you want your shade plants to continue to grow, after the first year, you might have to water them once in July and once in August, because once again, the soil in the forest tends to get quite dry in the summer. And the only other thing you might have to do is, if you have a lot of deer, certain things like trillium, like, what else was it that they ate? The European ginger and a few other things they might nibble on. So you might have to wind up fencing your shade garden in the woods to keep the deer. So can we open it up now to questions, folks?
Yep. So we're gonna close this up here. If you'd like, you may unmute yourselves if you have any questions. What I'm gonna do here is also